Hi, this is The Current. I'm Clive Priddle, and today I am joined by Kabir Sehgal and my colleague Gretchen Young. We are going to celebrate the life of John Lewis, partly to also celebrate the publication of this book, which is a collection of Congressman Lewis's thoughts that were collected towards the end of his life in the middle of 2020, a very difficult year for all of us. It's an inspiring collection, and we are very fortunate to have two people who worked with him on the book and knew him personally. So maybe I can ask each of you to perhaps walk us back to when you first met John Lewis and tell us how that interaction came about. Gretchen, would you like to start?
Of course. I pursued John Lewis for a book back in 2008. I had heard him speak at a number of events, and I was just absolutely mesmerized. And I was hooked. I started to research this incredible man, and I wrote to his office, and I tried very hard for a good number of years to reach him to pitch a book idea. Um, he's a busy man, and it took some time, but I just was relentless. And then fortuitously met Kabir, who's knew the congressman since he was a boy. His family had been friends for 30 plus years. And he helped out. And I finally met the congressman and was able to propose a book idea. And he said yes. And I was elated. And that book is Across That Bridge. And we stayed in touch ever since. So I reached out to him, of course, once the news was out that he had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And that call was an amazing call. Sort of the team, the Across That Bridge team, got back together. We were on the phone with him and Michael Collins, his chief of staff, and Kabir and Kabir's dad, and we just had this wonderful sort of reunion on the phone. And he was so upbeat and positive, as is John Lewis, at the very end. And we agreed to do a second collaboration. This time, my elation was tempered by the fact that I knew it would be his last, but I was forever grateful that he took the time to talk to us about what mattered most to him and what he was thinking in his, final months on this planet. It was surreal, but he was John Lewis to the end.
And Kabir, how do you know
I'm sitting here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I was born and raised and grew up, and it was an amazing time to really come of age in the late 80s and 90s because a lot of these civil rights legends, John Lewis, of course, being one of them, were in their prime, in their 50s and 60s, and they were in positions of leadership. He obviously was a congressman from the 5th District. So I grew up, he came to my father's office, and Georgia Democratic politics back then was quite a small circle. It's getting bigger, thankfully, but he was always kind of a figure in our household. And this year is the 25th anniversary of the Centennial Olympic Games that happened in Atlanta, and we spent a lot of time with Congressman John Lewis then. And it just, every time I would come back to Atlanta and there was a political event, he would be there, and it was an incredible relationship, and he's an incredible man. And I had the great fortune of traveling with him a few years ago to Selma, where he marched in Bloody Sunday. And he talks about in the book Carry On about how he thought he was going to die on that day. And it was a very moving experience. And he talks about how you have to have hope and persevere. And when I got the phone call out of the blue from Gretchen, it was really her idea to make this book happen. My first inclination was like this, go for it, go for it. It sounds like great. You should do it. You should do it. But obviously, it turned into quite a collaboration, and I'm so glad it has come out with Carry On. And to what I like about this book is that it sort of humanizes John Lewis, the man who I knew, what he liked to drink, what he liked to do on the holidays, how he liked to spend time with his family. It's not just a civil rights book. It's not just meditations on the philosophies of nonviolence. It's you know every page is an inspiration and a meditation on life. And I think that's what readers can really pick up from this is getting past the myth and legend of John Legend. Of course, there's always going to be that, but understanding how he spent his day to day And that's really what's really special about Carry On.
It's a lovely book because each of the short chapters is a kind of distillation of something, but they all have a very strong sense of voice. I never met Congressman Lewis, but I can sort of hear him in these pages, and it does feel like a terrific way for those of us who didn't have the chance to meet him, or to really get a sense of him and where his most important values sit, and abiding values of that. I was also struck by a couple other things, and I hope that maybe we could talk about that. So Lewis was the last of that great generation of civil rights leaders, last surviving one. And one of the reasons for that is that he was a very young man when the civil rights movement was in its heyday. And I was reminded by the book that he took an extraordinary amount of personal initiative as a teenage boy in Alabama to join this campaign. I have teenage children, as I'm sure many of us have, and the difference, in terms of initiative, what the risks that he took for his own life as a very young man are extraordinarily impressive. I wondered if we might reflect a little bit on where that young man came from, where that sense of mission came from, where the willingness to reach out and write directly to Martin Luther King, and then take up the invitation to meet him in Montgomery came from a guy who's not even 20 years old. What's your sense of him as a young man? Did you get to get a feeling for that, Kabir?
And he had an incredible initiative, and he wrote to he wrote to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a teenager, and he raised his hand and he went down to Montgomery. Dr. King and the civil rights leaders paid for his way to meet there, and he met Rosa Parks. So he was always, thinking about how to make things right. He grew up in Troy, Alabama, on a farm, and he knew that it wasn't right that folks would talk to his father and call him boy. And that didn't sit right with him. And he knew that one day he would like to be part of that change. And change was in the air. And I think a lot of young people from this book, they'll be able to see that change can happen with just writing a letter, writing an email, sending a tweet. If you demonstrate initiative, it's like, you put something out into the world, there's a reaction to it. And, Ambassador Andrew Young, who wrote the foreword to this book, who I think is one of the last remaining civil rights legends and leaders, he talks about in his foreword how when he went to the university that John Lewis was at, John Lewis was almost singularly focused on desegregating restaurants. He would dress in a tie. He would go to trainings, and they say, "Who is that?" "Oh, that's John Lewis." "Where's he going?" "Oh, he's going down to the restaurant to desegregate." I mean, he was focused on studies, but this was his mission, and he stayed, steadfast to that belief throughout his entire life. And I think this book can be a template for young people, young activists. There's a whole series of conversations on Black Lives Matters and how to commit to nonviolence. So I think any young person can take inspiration and a template from these pages.
Gretchen, I wanted to ask you about Black Lives Matter and what emotional resonance that had. It was really breaking as you were finishing up the book, and as John Lewis was in the last months of his life. He talks about it in the book, but did you get a sense from him of how he felt this mapped into the rest of his experience of being part of a persecuted minority in America?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that sort of got me thinking more about this book was his commentary on the phone about what was going on. And he was so heartened to see that people were taking to the streets and they were standing up and doing the good work and insisting on change. And so when he saw the protests, and because he was watching the news, he was all over it, reading the papers till the very end, he was really thrilled and optimistic. He did say that, and this was such an interesting part of the conversation, and one of the times where I was trying to figure out myself you know, why he would say this, which was, we have to be patient. And there's a section in the book on patience. But I thought this was a man who was at the March on Washington, and he was anything but patient. It was an urgency. It was enough for him. We can't stand by any longer. We have to make change.
We do not want to go to jail, but we will go to jail if this is the price we must pay for love, brotherhood, and true peace. I appeal to all of you to get in this great revolution that is sweeping this nation. Get in and stay in the streets of every city, every village and hamlet of this nation until true freedom comes, until the revolution of 1776 is complete. We must get in this revolution and complete the revolution. For in the Delta of Mississippi, in Southwest Georgia, in the Black Belt of Alabama, in Harlem, in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and all over this nation, the black mass is on the march for joy and freedom.
Kabir, I want to ask you specifically about Georgia. Of course, that's where John Lewis's congressional district was. He spent the bulk of his career thinking about Georgia politics. And Georgia had a couple of things happen in 2020, both very encouraging in the sense that the state flipped towards the Democrats, two new senators who were closely associated with John Lewis. And yet it also was the site of one of the most terrifying and horrific killings of a young black man, Ahmaud Arbery. So what did John Lewis understand was happening in Georgia? Did he see it as a place where his patience was about to be rewarded, or is it a state where the fight still has to be fought very hard?
I think it's both. Georgia, Atlanta was and is the heart of the civil rights movement. The nickname of our city that we sort of picked up in the 60s was the city too busy to hate. And Georgia has, and Atlanta especially, has an incredibly diverse population. And when I growing up, Georgia was a blue state, at least for me. It changed in around 2000, things went differently. But John Lewis was so committed to the state, and he would always say, people don't change, they grow. They grow. And it takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes resilience. And he never missed a chance to come, and he talks about in the book that he would come and he would march in the Atlanta Pride Parade almost every year. And this is in the 2000s, and when this was a controversial thing to do. Now it seems almost like, of course, most politicians would go and march in a parade that supports rights of anyone according to their orientation. But you're right. In the book, Ambassador Young talks about his resoluteness, and that rankled some folks in Georgia politics because sometimes he wouldn't vote for initiatives, whether it was a roads initiative or whether it was infrastructure development, because of his commitment and his commitment to his constituency. I'm sure he would have been very excited with the election of Raphael Warnock, who was this pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and his intern, John Ossoff, to the United States Senate. And I think it's really important that, Georgia, January 6th this past year was it started out being, I think, a great day with the news of these two senators, and the power shifted in the Senate. And I think Congressman Lewis would say something like, we need to use that power to bring about social change, to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that's now pending in the U.S. Congress. And he would see that as I think, as a victory. And I got to tell you, I went to a Georgia political fundraiser a couple of days ago, and the person who was most mentioned was John Lewis. And people were talking about it with such reverence and such joy. And I know that was a mutual affection. He loved Georgia, he loved Atlanta, and he knew that if it could work in Atlanta, it could work anywhere. And John Lewis is a great example of patience, as he talks about in the book. So I hope everyone checks it out, and I hope you come and visit Clive, Atlanta, and see. They just put up a big statue here down in Vine City of John Lewis. The Freedom Parkway is named after him. So we're doing our best to honor him in our own way down here.
The Freedom Parkway story is a funny one in the book too, because
Yeah, right.
he didn't want that road built, but
He was determined. I will say, I think he hoped, look, he may have known he wouldn't make it to November, but he wanted to be around for November because, and there's that part in the book about vote, vote, vote. He couldn't have more conviction when he was talking about voting, of course. And Georgia was amazing for that, during the presidential election. And I just thought for him, they rallied for him. They channeled him, and they were doing the good work. And of course now, and this is what he meant about it, the need to go out there and be a determined soul to fight for dignity and humanity. It doesn't end, because one minute we're cheering Georgia, and the next minute there are these rules in place to not allow voting for everyone in truth. And that's why, really, one of the reasons he wanted to do this last literary testament for those who have to continue on. And voting was top of his mind.
So the book makes it clear in a rather sweet way that sometimes it wasn't easy being around John Lewis because people treat him as a living saint. You couldn't go shopping with John Lewis because people literally wanted to sort of touch the hem of his garments. I wanted to ask you both, was he also a canny politician? Did he match that sort of high moral vision with a little bit of low political cunning?
Perhaps. Look, he knew that people admired him so much and did see him as a sainted man. Look, I mean, not everyone puts their life on the line for our country and for what's right. He knew, and he actually talks about this as well, that communication is key, right? He was a very simple communicator. He was a very authentic communicator. I think he knew that how to reach people. I think he knew how to get people to listen. And without that, you can't move forward because you need to be united. Kabir might be able to speak to some of the specifics of his time in Congress.
He was known as the conscience of the Congress. Republicans and Democrats alike wanted pictures with him. They would invite him, and Democrats, of course, would invite him to their districts to campaign, because if you did a fundraiser with John Lewis, people would turn up and people would write checks. And that's real influence and power, and especially in Congress. And he understood that. But he also took some really relatively unpopular positions that actually turned out and aged well, right? He came out against the Defense of Marriage Act in the 1996. Bill Clinton really wanted his vote, but he just couldn't. Vote ultimately for that, because he thought that was a deprivation of rights and a deprivation of what he had fought for in the 60s, and he talks about in the book. We turned to, I think just the other day was the 4 or 5 year anniversary of the Supreme Court decision that allows civil marriages, gay people to get married. So he was ahead of our times in terms of policies like that. He was also against the Iraq War. So he would challenge his party. And those two positions stand out to me because they show that you really have to vote your conscience in Congress, because time will tell. People will be on podcasts like this talking about was this person right in their legislative career, and I think so. And he was particularly influential again in Georgia. He was colloquially known as the dean of the Georgia Congress, and if he would, John Ossoff, I think, owes his candidacy to or his senateship to John Lewis because of that incredible hat that he cut. John Lewis really promoted John Ossoff. So this was a man that was in Congress over 30 years. He was close to Speaker Pelosi. He was close to the leadership. Everyone wanted his opinions and advice. And remember when he did the sit-in in Congress over gun violence? He knew how to dramatize movements as well, and that's one thing that I picked up in talking to him and others in the civil rights movement. It's important to also think in a way like a producer, and like, how do you dramatize certain issues? and he knew that nonviolent sit-ins would get attention in a good way and bring about real meaningful change. So I don't even think that's cunning. I think it's just being really smart and savvy about how to make social change happen.
It's kind of interesting to me that, as you say, he was redeploying the tactics of the civil rights movement from the 1960s in 2006 and beyond. And yet, this is a guy who, when he came to Congress, the biggest person in Georgia politics at that time was Newt Gingrich. It feels like Newt Gingrich is sort of the antithesis of John Lewis, but you would expect at least that here's a young John Lewis getting to Congress for the first time, and he must be aware that there's an awful lot of maneuvering and there's a lot of backroom deals being done and arms being twisted, and he doesn't seem to have really played that game at all. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'm actually sitting here in the 6th district, Newt Gingrich's district. When I left Atlanta, Newt Gingrich was the congressman, and I returned many years later, and we have a Democratic congressperson. I can't find any Red Lobsters. I can't find any Applebee's. There's more Vietnamese restaurants. Because that, and this is testament to John Lewis' comment that things take time, they take patience, they grow. And I'm comparing then and now because I didn't see it every day, Georgia. But the very thought that Newt Gingrich representing this district seems like I can't believe that happened. Considering the demographics of this movement, and that's again, he said, "Stay the course. Things will change. Don't give up hope." Um, and he worked with Republicans. People think that we're all so divided. He did work on bipartisan resolution. He was involved in campaign finance reform. He sought out partners whatever he can. He understood that from the civil rights movement with Dr. King. It's important to work with business leaders. It's important to work with people who are your enemy. He talks about in the book about forgiving people who created injustice or someone tried to kill him, stomped all over him in South Carolina, and he speaks movingly about how this person in the early 2000s came and said, "I wanted to meet you. I'm the person who beat you up all those years ago in Rock Hill, South Carolina. I want to ask your forgiveness." And they hug. We think about that. So this is a man who who lived to see his assailant become asking for forgiveness. So if that's possible, anything's possible.
He had no bitterness. I think that struck me when he would speak, having gone through what he had gone through. I also think I think what made him an incredible politician was he had no fear. And I mean, every kind of fear that a human has. I mean, you start out with he's 16 years old and he's writing to Martin Luther King. No worries, no fear. What could happen? He wouldn't get a response. This is a man who knew if he crossed that bridge, he was going to be beaten. He was arrested 45 times, 5 times in Congress. He sat at a counter. He tried to desegregate restrooms, and he knew he would be beaten to a pulp, and he was. Then he gets to Congress. It's not as physical a battle, but these are battles, and for him, I think going in without fear, being able to vote against the norm or stand up when people think he would not, because he would go the easy route. John Lewis didn't have to do that, and he never would do that because he had already been through the worst.
About President Biden, John Lewis gave his endorsement to Biden, and indeed, I think to the idea of Kamala Harris. I don't think she was yet the VP when he said he wanted to see a woman on the ticket. And I assume he was pretty close to Biden. They'd had long political careers, one in the Senate, one in Congress. Was that a real political friendship? Was Biden his ideal president, or was it a kind of, yeah, he's the best guy for the moment, he'll get us over the line?
Congressman Lewis and Joe Biden knew each other for 30 years. Remember when Joe Biden came in, he was just was a young person in his early 30s, late 20s, and they formed, it's not really well known, a sort of political union over the many years, just being in the halls of Congress together. And John Lewis endorsed him robustly, and because he also knew that Joe Biden was going to enact legislation and push for legislation that was in keeping with the John Lewis vision of what public policy should be. Look what's happening now. In the book, John Lewis talks about, why are we fighting all these wars? We should be building up our roads and investing in hospitals at home. And what's the policy we're talking about now? We're talking about Joe Biden is talking about coming back from pulling troops from Afghanistan and simultaneously investing in a large infrastructure bill that builds up the roads, the hospitals, and telecom and rural internet into rural areas. So from a policy perspective, they're in alignment, and I think let's not lose fact of that. And just 2 days ago, Joe Biden said, "What we need the John Lewis Voting Rights Act," and that's what's a clarion call to make that happen. And John Lewis would have looked aghast at what's happening in state by state, what's happening in Texas, what's happening in Georgia with voting rights, and he would be on the front lines, I would imagine, pushing, urging President Biden and others to pass meaningful voting rights legislation. Because if you lose your vote, I mean, this is the stuff they they work so hard and sacrifice for. So I see what's happening in Congress is the best way we can honor the legacy of John Legacy. In addition, of course, checking out this book.
I want to leave this with one more question about John Lewis's sense of the possible for America, and how he saw his ideas of hope perhaps being realized. So when you think of the future that he wanted for the country, what do you think would be his 2 or 3 priorities? What do you think the rest of us who now have to take on his legacy, what could we do for John Lewis?
Oh goodness, great question. I think what we can do for John Lewis is to continue to persevere in the face of adversity. That's what he did to his dying day. To have determination, and to not allow hatred to reign. Ultimately, he was a shining example. He represented um, that kind of perseverance. He believed in humanity. And I think what he would want is for us to believe that our better natures will eventually prevail. And he had that faith, and he repeated that time and time again on the phone.
I mean, I think it's to vote, especially in the face of what's happening. I know the midterm elections are years away. It would be to write your congressman, ask him to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, to show up at the ballot box, and just to be an engaged citizen, because you know it's pernicious and dangerous what's happening about Republican legislators being able to change who wins an election. You would think that in this country you would want to more people, everyone would be in favor of more people voting, but that seems not to be the case, and it's historically not been the case. So let's honor John Lewis by pushing for, advocating, and embracing the issues he would be pushing for, and that's voting rights. So let's vote, 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 as he says, write it all over the page. And voting is not just one day in November; it's an everyday commitment to make sure that the legislation is being enacted that supports us, and so we can see meaningful change, and we don't end up with crazy policies. So that's how I'm gonna honor John Lewis. I'm gonna be volunteering down here in Georgia to be registering voters as much as possible.
Absolutely. You got to walk the walk. You got to act. Um, and he would want to see that, and he was heartened to see it. But it's not over. There's more fight to go. But if anyone listening to this, or anyone who, I hope they read the book because it will motivate them, it will inspire them, they will feel like they want to rally, is that when you think of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, for example, when he passed and they were driving his body across that bridge with roses, the state troopers by his side following. I mean, who could ever have imagined that in the 50s and 60s, right? Things do change, but we have to make that happen. And he was on the front lines all the time.
And let's rename the Edmund Pettus Bridge the John Lewis Bridge.
Right.
That's a great note to end. Thank you so much, Kabir Sehgal, Gretchen Young, for joining us and for celebrating the life of John Lewis, and for bringing us this, as I say, lovely book, the sort of distillation of John Lewis. So thank you both.
Oh, it means a lot. I really appreciate your having us on. Thank you so much, Clive.
Thank you, Clive.
Hachette,